Woohoo, we're live. This is Math 60 Intermediate Algebra, Chapter 7, Section 7.1, and this is radical expressions and radical functions. Woohoo! So we're going to be talking about square roots and radicals and radical signs and all that fun stuff. But before we get started, we've got a couple pages just to make sure we're all on the same page with the vocabulary. Woohoo! So, among other things, what we're going to be talking about is square roots. And in order to talk about square roots, I want to talk about squares. So, 2, the quantity squared, equals 2 times 2, which is 4. Woohoo! -2, the quantity squared. Remember, that means I square the -2, and that is also 4. So when we square 2 or -2, we get to 4. So in other words, squaring makes math forget whether you started out positive or negative. So there's no way to know. If I tell you that the square is 4, you don't know whether I started with 2 or -2. So that means there are 2 square roots of 4. Now this may be new for you because a lot of people say the square root of 4 is 2, but there are actually 2 of them. So let's talk about some vocabulary, much of which I will not use, but 2 is the principal or positive square root if you want to be really, really precise, and -2 is the negative square root. So slightly different language, positive or negative or principal, which means it's the main one. It's the one people usually think of first. All positive real numbers have a principal/positive square root and a negative square root. So all positive real numbers have 2 square roots. So then what is a radical? Well, the thing that a lot of people call a square root sign is actually called a radical sign. So this guy right there, that's called a radical sign. Now you'll notice that I draw mine kind of fancy. I have a little step right here, a little seat right here. That's for when we get into cube roots later. And I also have what I think of as like a little garage door. This closes the radical. Now, this is kind of common, but not super common. This is really weird. I've only known 2 people, including myself and the teacher who taught it to me. I've only known the 2 of us who do this. So this is really uncommon. So you don't need to do that with me. You can leave yours flat at top if you'd like. So when I get this, a lot of people would call this thing the square root of 25. And honestly, that's really common. But if you want to say it like to be really sound professional and be precise, it's radical 25. And that is the principal square root of 25. So in other words, when I see this radical sign around 25, it means I want the positive one. I want positive 5. Okay, so what if you want the negative one? Well, if you want the negative one, you put the negative out in front. And if there's a negative out in front, it's negative radical 25, or the opposite of radical 25 equals -5. So if you want the positive, go with the plain version. If you want the negative, put a minus out in front. That's all. Now, sometimes when we take square roots or radicals, radical 2 is not something nice. This is a non-terminating, non-repeating decimal. Do you remember that? That's an irrational number. Remember that? The irrational numbers. I'm going to use my handy dandy highlighter just to highlight this. Sometimes square roots are irrational. And when they're irrational, we're not generally going to write out this part of it because it takes too long. We're just going to leave it as radical 2. Or again, a lot of people say square root of 2 or principal square root of 2. That's fine. So instead, we'll just write that as the symbol. So far, so good? Cool. Okay, the vocabulary stuff is done. Now let's go through kind of the basics. Just in case you haven't done radicals in a while, I want to review a bunch of these. So let's go through this. Woohoo. Okay, so we're going to be simplifying. Radical 16, square root of 16 is 4. Woohoo! And that was the positive one since it's plain. It doesn't have any sign out in front. Now this one has a minus out in front, which means it's the opposite of radical 16 or negative radical 16, or let's be honest, negative square root of 16 is what a lot of people call it. That's -4. Woohoo. The next one, if you've never dealt with square roots or radicals of fractions, might feel a little weird. And let me write it big so you guys can see what's really going on. Radical 1/16. So here's the thing. When you've got a fraction, you can split up the radical. We're going to talk about this more in another section, but I'm just going to give you a little preview. You're allowed to split up the radicals, which makes it a lot easier, because then we've got radical 1, or the square root of 1, which is 1, and radical 16, or the square root of 16, which is 4. Just like that. Ta-da! So you do the top and bottom separately. Same thing here. If I've got square root or radical 25 over 16, I'm going to split it up. Radical 25 all over radical 16. Square root of 25, the principal square root or the positive square root is 5. Principal or positive square root of 16 is 4. Bam, we're done. Oh, and let me move this up. Okay, so what's going to be a problem? Well, until the very end of this chapter, we're not going to be able to deal with negatives. So what we're going to say is if there's a minus sign inside a square root, inside a radical sign, we're going to say does not exist, cannot be simplified. Now, both of these are kind of lying. Because this can be simplified. You just might not know how to do it yet. We're going to learn how to do it at the end of chapter 7. It involves something called complex numbers and the letter I. And if you haven't ever studied that before, that's fine. We'll get to it. But for right now, you can either write one of these, which is fine for us right now, or if you want to be true, absolutely true, you would say not real. And this is completely true. So you've got a lot of options for what you say. And we allow, so the way that math works is every time you go through a subject, we give you a little bit more information. We do this kind of spiral. And so at this point, we are not expecting you've ever heard of imaginary numbers or the square root of -1 sort of thing. So what we're going to say is you can say does not exist, cannot be simplified. That's fine. But if you want to be correct, if you want to be really precise, I might choose not real. So anytime you see a square root with a minus sign, you can just say not real. You're also welcome to say those. Now, what about, notice in number 6, we try to simplify it a little bit. We try to say, well, what about if there's a minus inside and a minus outside? Do they cancel and make that, oops, sorry, you guys can't see that. It's really hard to do with this camera. 2 minuses make a plus. And the answer is no. No, it actually just makes it worse. It's the opposite of something that's not real. And again, let me grab my handy dandy highlighter, because the highlighter, if you have a highlighter, nothing bad's going to be able to happen to you there. Okay, there we go. That minus sign right there tells us it's not real. So that's our answer for this one. And then radical 0. What's the square root of 0? Well, this is the one number that has a single answer. The square root of 0 is 0. And you know what? Let me do 7.5. What is the opposite of the square root of 0? I think this might be in your homework, so I might be doing your homework for you. What if I put a minus out in front? Minus 0 is still 0. So square root of 0, radical 0 is going to be 0. So now, up until then, I'm hoping you've seen most of that. Now, this is where we're going to begin the brand new stuff that you might not have seen before. So, the parts of a radical. So, the actual drawing of this thing, that's the radical sign. We talked about that before. This is my least favorite word in the English language, radicand. I don't like it. I think it's a horrible word. Sorry, I just don't like it. Radicand. And then here, this little number, notice right there, where I would put my little seat. Give it a place to sit. There we go. This is called the index. It just is called the index. And this is not something you need to know, but I wanted to tell you so you're familiar if I use these words in the videos. Or in person, if we ever get to go back to seeing each other in person. Woohoo. Okay, so in square roots, in a square root, the index is 2, but we don't write it. So it would be 2 there with the radical. But usually it's just understood. If you just see a radical sign, it is the square root. Does that make sense? So that's the square root of 17. However, what I could do is I could ask you, this is called the cube root of 8. See the 3 sitting there? It's the cube root of 8. And so it asks, what cubed gives me 8? And the answer is 2. Cube root of 8 is 2. Now, on your handy dandy calculator, this is going to be really different for everybody. I realize I'm doing this in the dark. Let me lighten it up a little bit so you can see my calculator. There's my calculator. I have on this calculator, if I turn off the light, is it easier to see? Maybe it's a little easier to see. Okay, you can almost see it right there. You see I have an X root. So on a calculator, so I have a key. My exponent key has above has that key right there. It says X with a radical sign. And so what I would do on my calculator, you see this without too much glare? Kind of. So what I believe I would do is I would do 3, and then second, and then this guy, and then 8. So I did the cube root. Can you see that? Cube root of 8. And it tells me it's 2. So that's on my calculator. The problem is a lot of people's calculators are different. So you're going to have to play around with it. But my calculator, I'll write it down again. So the cube root of 8 is 3. And then I have to do second. And then I have to do this key. And then 8. And then equals. And so that's how I do the calculator. Woohoo. So that's my calculator. Sorry, you can't quite see the equals there at the end. So again, the index comes first. And then second, get this root, this radical with an index 8. Now, there's another key on the calculator, really close. In mine, it's right next to it. See how that's the plane? Can you see the plane square root right there, the plane radical? It doesn't have, it's going to be dangerous as anything. But let me see if I can bring it up close. Can it find it? A little bit. So right there, see how that one is plane? And then this one is the xth root. It's kind of hard to see, but on your calculator, check for which one is which. Okay, now, just when everything seemed like it was getting good and made perfect sense, I am now going to tell you that the cube root of -8 does exist, and it is real. I'm going to say it's -2. Why is that? Well, let's take a look. -2 cubed is -2 times -2 times -2. Now here, when I do 3 minuses, right, these 2 minuses go together and make each other happy, but this one's left out. So it's going to make the whole thing sad. So when we cube things, cubing preserves that minus sign. So it knows that it was negative. So we can get to a -8. So cube root of -8 is -2. Even though if I asked you for, let's make number 10. Can you see number 10 right down at the bottom? Even though if I asked you what the square root, the principal square root of -8 is, I would say that's not real. So if it's a square root, it's not real. If it's a cube root, it's real. Okay, how about the 4th root? 4th root, not real. 5th root, real. As long as it's an odd number, you're allowed to have a negative. So let me put a little note here. So if it's an even, you can see I'm thinking really hard because when I'm thinking really hard, I can't talk. So take a look at the difference. I don't know if you understand this. Hopefully it makes some sense. If the index is even, the even root of a negative is not real. The odd root of a negative is fine. Okay? Woohoo. That's 7.1. Go forth and be mathematical.